The sound still comes to me in the dead of night, that low-frequency hum that makes my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. 60 years have passed since that October evening in Salem, Massachusetts, and yet the memory is as vivid as if it happened yesterday, burned into my consciousness with a permanence that transcends normal human recollection. I was a physics teacher then, 32 years old, a man who believed only in what could be measured, tested, proven through the scientific method. That belief died on October 15th, 1965, replaced by a terrible certainty that our understanding of the universe is laughably incomplete, that we are children playing with toys, while something vast and incomprehensible watches from the darkness between the stars. My hands tremble as I record these words, not from the weakness of my 92-year-old body, but from the weight of what I carry, a frequency implanted in my skull that night, a vibration that bypassed my ears entirely and settled deep in my brain stem, where it has resonated ever since. A reminder that I was touched by something beyond human comprehension and will never be the same. It was October 15th, 1965, a Thursday night, and I had stayed late at Salem High School grading papers in my classroom on the 3rd floor. The building was empty. The janitor had already made his rounds, and I was alone with the hum of the old radiator and the scratch of my red pen against student essays about Newton's laws of motion. Outside my window, the old cemetery across the street lay in darkness, its crooked colonial headstones casting long shadows in the streetlight. And beyond that, the woods that stretched for miles toward the coast. I remember checking my watch and seeing it was nearly 11, thinking my wife Margaret would be worried, gathering my papers into my leather satchel when the lights flickered. Not unusual for that old building with its ancient electrical system. But then they flickered again and again, in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, almost deliberate, like Morse code, but not quite. Like something was trying to communicate through the very infrastructure of the building itself. Then the sound began. At first, I thought it was the radiator, that old beast finally giving up after decades of service. But this was different. This was a low-frequency hum that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. A vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. It grew louder, or perhaps closer. I couldn't tell which. Rising in pitch slowly like a massive generator spinning up to speed. And with it came a pressure in my head, behind my eyes, as if the air in the room was becoming denser, heavier, pressing down on me from all directions. I went to the window thinking maybe there was some kind of emergency outside, a fire truck or an ambulance. But what I saw made my blood run cold and my rational mind shatter into 1,000 pieces that I've been trying to put back together ever since. There was a light in the woods, but not like any light I'd ever seen. It wasn't the warm yellow of a flashlight or the harsh white of a searchlight. It was a blue-green luminescence that seemed to pulse in time with that unbearable sound, casting the trees in an alien glow that made them look like they were underwater, their branches swaying, though there was no wind, their leaves trembling with that same frequency that was now making the windows rattle in their frames. The light was moving, weaving between the trees, coming closer to the edge of the woods, and as it moved, the sound changed, became more complex, layered with harmonics that shouldn't have been possible, frequencies that overlapped and interfered with each other in ways that violated everything I knew about acoustic physics. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it made no difference. The sound was inside me now, resonating with something deep in my brainstem, something primal and terrified. I should have run. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of that building, to get into my car and drive home and forget what I was seeing, but I couldn't move. I was transfixed, paralyzed not by fear exactly, but by a kind of awful fascination, the same morbid curiosity that makes you slow down at a car accident, even though you don't want to see. The light cleared the tree line, and I could see it fully now, hovering about 20 feet above the cemetery, and my mind struggled to make sense of what my eyes were showing me. It was a craft. There's no other word for it, but not like any aircraft I'd ever seen or read about. It was roughly disc-shaped, maybe 40 feet in diameter, with a domed top that seemed to be made of some kind of dark metallic material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. And around its circumference were what looked like panels or ports that glowed with that same blue-green light, pulsing in sequence like lights on a carnival ride, but far more purposeful, far more intelligent in their pattern. The sound reached a crescendo that I thought would split my skull open, and then, suddenly, silence. Not natural silence, but the absence of all sound, as if someone had thrown a switch and turned off the audio of the world. I couldn't hear my own breathing, couldn't hear my heart pounding in my chest, though I could feel it hammering against my ribs. The craft hung there in that impossible silence, rotating slowly, and I noticed for the first time that the grass beneath it, the headstones, everything in its vicinity was completely still, frozen as if time itself had stopped in a circle directly below this thing. Then the sound returned, but different now. Not a hum, but a series of pulses, rhythmic and deliberate. And with each pulse, the light from the craft brightened, dimmed, brightened again. And I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach that it was scanning, measuring, analyzing something about the area, or perhaps about the building. Perhaps about me standing there in the window, like an idiot, instead of hiding under my desk. I don't know how long I stood there watching. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose its meaning in the presence of this thing. I became aware of details I couldn't possibly have seen from that distance. The way the metal of the craft seemed to shimmer as if it wasn't entirely solid, as if it was phasing in and out of our reality. The way the air around it bent light like heat waves off summer pavement. The way there were markings on its surface that might have been writing or symbols, but in no alphabet or language I'd ever encountered. And then I saw something that made my knees buckle, and I had to grip the windowsill to stay upright. There were figures moving around the base of the craft. Or rather, I saw the suggestion of figures. Shapes that were almost, but not quite humanoid. Tall and thin with movements that were too fluid, too graceful. As if they weren't quite bound by the same physical laws that governed everything else. One of them, and I will never forget this as long as I live, turned and looked directly at my window. I couldn't see its face, couldn't make out features in the strange light, but I felt its attention on me like a physical weight, like I was a specimen under a microscope, something to be studied and catalogued and filed away. The sound changed again, became higher pitched, almost a whine, and images began flooding my mind that weren't my own thoughts. I saw other worlds, planets with purple skies and double suns, cities of impossible geometry that hurt to look at, vast expanses of space dotted with stars I didn't recognize. I saw Earth from orbit, but not as it was in 1965. I saw it as it had been thousands of years ago, and as it might be thousands of years in the future. I saw the rise and fall of civilizations in fast forward, the whole of human history compressed into a few terrible seconds of understanding that we are not alone, have never been alone, and that our significance in the universe is so much smaller than we imagine. Then pain, incredible searing pain behind my eyes, as if my brain was being pulled apart and put back together, restructured, rewired. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, and when I looked up again through tears, the craft was rising, moving up and away at an angle that should have been impossible for anything heavier than air, accelerating so rapidly that it should have created a sonic boom, but instead made only that sound, that frequency that I can still hear sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep. a resonance that seems to come from inside my own skull rather than from any external source. It shot straight up into the night sky, the blue-green light fading as it went higher, and then it was gone, vanished as if it had never been there at all, leaving me alone on the floor of my classroom with a nosebleed and a headache that would last for 3 days. I sat there for, I don't know how long, maybe an hour, maybe more, trying to process what I'd just witnessed, trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination, some kind of stress-induced psychotic break brought on by too many late nights and too much coffee. But when I finally stood up on shaking legs and looked out the window again, I could see the evidence that it had been real. The grass in the cemetery where the craft had hovered was dead, earned in a perfect circle about 50 feet in diameter. And even from the 3rd floor, I could see that the headstones within that circle had been knocked over or pushed back as if by an enormous pressure from above. The trees at the edge of the woods, where I'd first seen the light, were stripped of leaves on one side, bare branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. And there was a smell that I could detect even through the closed window, a sharp ozone smell mixed with something else, something organic and wrong that made my stomach turn. I gathered my things in a daze and left the building, walking to my car in the parking lot like a man in a dream, fumbling with my keys, dropping them twice before I could get the door unlocked. The drive home was a blur. I have no memory of it. And the next thing I knew, I was sitting in my driveway staring at my dark house, wondering how I was going to explain to Margaret why I was 3 hours late, wondering if I should explain at all, or just make up some story about car trouble or losing track of time. I sat there with the engine running and the radio playing some jazz program I wasn't really hearing, and I made a decision that I've regretted ever since. I decided to tell the truth. Margaret was waiting up, worried as I'd expected, and when I walked in, she took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I must have looked terrible, white as a sheet with dried blood under my nose, and that 1,000-yard stare that soldiers get when they've seen too much combat. She made me sit down at the kitchen table and poured me a whiskey I didn't want, but drank anyway, and then I told her everything. I watched her face go from concern to disbelief to fear as I described what I'd seen. The craft, the figures, the sound that was more than sound, the visions that had been forced into my mind. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, just holding my hand across the table, and then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "We have to report this. We have to tell someone official. The police or the Air Force or someone." And I realized she believed me, my rational, skeptical wife who teased me for reading science fiction, believed every word I'd said. The next morning, Friday, I called in sick to school, and we drove together to the Salem Police Department. The officer at the desk was polite enough when I said I wanted to report something unusual I'd seen, but I could see his expression change when I started talking about the craft and the lights and the sound. He wrote it down dutifully in a little notebook, nodding along, but his eyes had that glassy look that cops get when they're humoring someone they think is crazy. He said he'd pass my report along to the relevant authorities, and that someone would be in touch if they needed more information. And that was that. Margaret and I drove to the cemetery on our way home, and the circle of dead grass was there, just as I'd seen it from my window. A perfect ring of brown and blackened earth where nothing would grow for years afterward. The overturned headstones had already been noticed by the groundskeeper, who told us when we asked that he'd found them that way this morning and assumed it was vandalism. Kids from the high school, probably, and he was already making arrangements to have them reset. I took photographs with my Kodak camera, black and white shots that came out blurry and indistinct. The circle visible, but not as dramatic as it appeared in person. The kind of photos that could be dismissed as anything, storm damage or chemical spill or hoax. I kept those photographs for years in a shoebox in my closet, taking them out sometimes late at night when I couldn't sleep, studying them for details I might have missed. Proof that I could show people to make them understand that I wasn't crazy and what I'd seen was real. But photographs prove nothing to people who don't want to believe. I learned that over the following weeks and months as I tried and failed to get anyone to take me seriously. 2 days after my report to the police, 2 men in dark suits came to my house. They showed me government identification that said they were from the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations, and they asked me to tell them again what I'd seen on Thursday night. I went through the whole story once more carefully this time, watching their faces for any sign that they believed me or thought I was wasting their time. They asked detailed questions about the timing, the size of the craft, the appearance of the figures, the nature of the sound, taking notes in identical black notebooks with identical efficient handwriting. They asked if I'd been drinking that night, if I was on any medications, if I had a history of mental illness or hallucinations. They asked about my war service. I'd been in the Pacific in 43 and 44. Asked if I'd ever experienced flashbacks or what they called combat fatigue. They were professional, courteous even, but underneath it all I could sense their skepticism, their unspoken conclusion that I was either lying or delusional, or both. Before they left, one of them, the younger one with the crew cut and the cold eyes, gave me what he called friendly advice. He said that spreading stories about unidentified flying objects could cause unnecessary panic in the community, could damage my reputation as an educator, could raise questions about my fitness to teach impressionable young minds. He said it would be in everyone's best interest if I kept my experience to myself, if I stopped showing people photographs and trying to get them to visit the cemetery to see the evidence. He said this with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and I understood what he wasn't saying directly, that this was a warning, a threat wrapped in polite language, that if I continued to make noise about what I'd seen, there would be consequences. They left after extracting what they called a verbal agreement that I would be more discreet in the future, and I watched their black sedan pull away from my curb with a sick feeling that I'd just been silenced by my own government. But I couldn't stay silent, not completely. Over the next few weeks, I started researching, spending my evenings at the Salem Public Library, reading everything I could find about unidentified flying objects. And I was shocked to discover how many sightings there had been, how many people like me had seen things they couldn't explain and had been dismissed or ridiculed or threatened into silence. I read about Kenneth Arnold's sighting in 1947 that started the whole flying saucer craze, about Roswell and the weather balloon explanation that nobody really believed, about the Washington, D.C. sightings in 1952 where UFOs had buzzed the Capitol and showed up on multiple radar screens. And still the official explanation was weather, phenomena, or temperature inversions. I read about Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official investigation into UFO reports, and how nearly all sightings were explained away as misidentifications of planets or stars or aircraft or balloons or swamp gas or any of 100 other mundane causes. I found accounts from other witnesses who described sounds similar to what I'd heard. That low-frequency vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, that made you feel sick and disoriented and filled your head with images that weren't your own. I found descriptions of craft that matched what I'd seen, disc-shaped objects with rotating lights, metallic surfaces that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, movements that defied conventional physics. And I found accounts of the aftermath, the dead grass, the physical effects on witnesses, the nosebleeds and headaches and psychological trauma that lasted for years. I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced, but that knowledge brought no comfort. Only a growing frustration that so many people had seen these things, and still the official position was that they didn't exist. that we were all mistaken or crazy or lying. In December of 1965, about 2 months after my sighting, I was called into the principal's office at Salem High School. Mr. Patterson was uncomfortable, wouldn't quite meet my eyes as he told me that there had been complaints from parents, concerns that I was discussing inappropriate topics with students, that I'd been asking them if they'd seen anything unusual in the sky, that I'd been bringing my obsession with flying saucers into the classroom. I tried to defend myself, said I'd only mentioned it once or twice in the context of teaching about the scientific method and the importance of investigating unexplained phenomena, but he cut me off. He said that my contract for the following year was in jeopardy unless I dropped this entire subject and focused on teaching physics as outlined in the approved curriculum. It was another warning, another attempt to silence me, and this time it worked because I had a family to support and a mortgage to pay, and I couldn't afford to lose my job over something that nobody believed anyway. So I stopped talking about it, at least publicly. I put the photographs away, stopped going to the library to research, stopped bringing it up at dinner parties, where people would exchange awkward glances and change the subject as quickly as possible. I became, to all outward appearances, the rational, skeptical physics teacher I'd always been, a man who believed in observable phenomena and repeatable experiments. But at night, in the dark, I would lie awake listening to that sound in my head, that impossible frequency that I knew I would hear for the rest of my life. And I would remember the moment when that figure turned to look at me, and I felt the crushing weight of its attention, the sense that I had been marked somehow, changed by the encounter in ways I couldn't fully understand. The years passed. I taught physics, raised my children, watched the world change around me. Man landed on the moon in 1969, and I watched it on television with tears streaming down my face. Not just from pride or wonder, but from the bitter knowledge that we were just beginning to explore our own solar system, while others had clearly mastered interstellar travel long ago. The UFO phenomenon continued. More sightings, more encounters, more official denials. Project Blue Book was shut down in 1969 with the conclusion that UFOs posed no threat to national security, and there was no evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. Never mind the thousands of unexplained cases in their own files. The whole subject became a joke, fodder for tabloids and conspiracy theorists. Anyone who claimed to have seen a UFO was automatically lumped in with people who believed in Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and ancient aliens building the pyramids. I retired from teaching in 1985, 20 years after my sighting, and Margaret and I moved to a small house on the coast, not far from Salem, but far enough that I didn't have to drive past that cemetery every day and be reminded of what I'd seen. I thought maybe with retirement would come peace, that I could finally put the whole experience behind me and enjoy my golden years. But the sound wouldn't let me go. It was there in quiet moments, that low-frequency hum that made my chest vibrate and my teeth ache. Not as loud as it had been that night, but persistent, constant. A reminder that I had been touched by something beyond human understanding, and that touch had left a permanent mark on my psyche. In the 90s, I started writing down my experience in detail, trying to capture every aspect of what I'd seen and felt and heard that night. I wrote hundreds of pages, filling notebook after notebook with descriptions and diagrams and speculations about the nature of the craft and its occupants and their purpose in visiting Earth. I wasn't writing for publication. I knew no reputable outlet would touch a first-person UFO account from an elderly retired teacher. I was writing for myself, trying to make sense of an experience that had defined the second half of my life, even as I tried to pretend it hadn't happened. The act of writing was therapeutic in a way, forcing me to confront the full reality of what I'd witnessed instead of letting it lurk at the edges of my consciousness. Margaret passed away in 2003. And with her went my last connection to that night. The only other person who had believed me without question, who had stood by me through the investigations and the warnings and the years of frustrated silence. At her funeral, our daughter asked me what I was going to do now, how I was going to fill my days without Mom to take care of. And I told her I was going to finish my manuscript, that I owed it to Margaret and to myself to complete the record of what happened in 1965, even if nobody ever read it. She looked at me with such sadness, such pity, and I realized that she thought I was losing my grip on reality. That grief was making me retreat into this old delusion. This story about flying saucers that she'd grown up hearing about and had long ago decided was either a misunderstanding or a breakdown, or an elaborate joke her father refused to abandon. But I wasn't crazy. I'm not crazy now. I know what I saw that night in Salem. I know what I heard. I know the effect it had on me, both physically and psychologically. And more than that, I know I wasn't alone. In the age of the internet, I've connected with other witnesses, people who saw similar craft in different places at different times, people who heard that same impossible sound and felt that same sense of being observed, studied, cataloged by an intelligence so far beyond our own that we can barely comprehend the gulf between us. We share our stories in private forums on obscure websites, comparing notes and looking for patterns. And while the mainstream world continues to dismiss US as cranks or attention seekers or people who can't tell Venus from a spacecraft, we know the truth. The sound has never left me. It's fainter now, after almost 60 years, more of a tinnitus-like ringing than the skull-splitting vibration I experienced that night. But it's always there, a constant reminder that I was in the presence of something extraordinary, something that changed me on a fundamental level. Sometimes I wonder if it was intentional, if whatever intelligence operated that craft deliberately left me with this auditory scar, a beacon or a marker that would identify me to others of their kind should they return. Sometimes I wonder if the visions I saw that night, the alien worlds and impossible geometries, were meant to be messages, information encoded directly into my neural pathways that I'm supposed to understand or decipher or pass along to others. I've had other strange experiences over the years, nothing as dramatic as that night in '65, but still unexplainable by conventional science. Electronic devices malfunction around me more than seems statistically probable. Watches stop running after a few weeks on my wrist. Computers freeze and crash when I'm using them. I sometimes know things I shouldn't know, have premonitions or intuitions that turn out to be accurate more often than chance would allow. I've had dreams of that craft returning, of the beings inside it communicating with me, not through language, but through pure thought, through emotional resonance, and I wake from these dreams with tears on my face and a longing I can't quite name, a homesickness for a place I've never been. I'm 92 years old now, living in an assisted living facility not far from where it all happened. My body is failing, my hands shake, my eyes are dim. My memory for recent events is spotty at best, but I remember that night with perfect clarity. Every detail as sharp and vivid as if it happened yesterday instead of nearly 6 decades ago. I remember the color of that light, that impossible blue-green luminescence. I remember the pattern of the pulsing panels around the craft's circumference. I remember the graceful, fluid movements of those tall, thin figures. And most of all, I remember the sound, that frequency that resonated with something deep in my brain. That changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I don't expect you to believe me. I've spent 60 years being disbelieved, dismissed, patronized, and threatened. And I've made my peace with the fact that my testimony alone will never be enough to convince a skeptical world that we are not alone in the universe. But I'm not telling you this to convince you of anything. I'm telling you because I need to testify, to bear witness to what I experienced before I die and take this knowledge to my grave. I'm telling you because somewhere out there is another person like me. Someone who saw something they can't explain, who heard a sound that still haunts them, who's been told they're crazy or mistaken or lying. And that person needs to know they're not alone, that what they experienced was real, that the burden of this knowledge doesn't have to be carried in isolation. The sound I heard that night in Salem in 1965 still haunts me. It haunts me when I'm trying to sleep and the facility is quiet except for the breathing of my roommate in the next bed. It haunts me when I'm sitting in the day room watching television shows about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, knowing that the intelligence has already found us and chosen not to make formal contact for reasons we can only guess at. It haunts me when I read news articles about Navy pilots encountering unexplained aerial phenomena, and finally, the government admitting that yes, there are objects in our skies that we can't identify and don't understand. Decades too late for all the witnesses like me who were silenced and ridiculed and told we imagined it all. That sound is a tattoo on my soul, an indelible mark left by an encounter with something so far beyond human experience that our language has no adequate words to describe it. When I close my eyes, I can still feel the vibration in my chest, can still sense that presence turning its attention toward me, can still see that impossible craft hovering over the cemetery with its pulsing lights and its promise of mysteries we're not yet ready to understand. The sound is my proof, my one piece of irrefutable evidence that I was there, that it was real, that something incredible and terrifying and beautiful happened to me on a Thursday night in October of 1965. I don't know why they came to Salem that night. I don't know why they chose to hover over that particular cemetery, to examine that particular building, to focus their attention on me, standing in my third-floor classroom window when they could have chosen anyone. I don't know if they're still watching us, still visiting Earth, still abducting people, and marking them with sounds and visions and unexplained abilities. I don't know if they're benevolent observers studying a primitive species, or something more sinister, something with intentions we can't fathom and wouldn't like if we could. All I know is that they were here, that I saw them, that they changed me, and that the sound they made will echo in my head until the day I die, and perhaps even beyond. Sometimes, in my more hopeful moments, I imagine that death will bring answers, that when my heart finally stops and my brain shuts down for the last time, I'll find myself face to face with whatever intelligence operated that craft, and they'll explain why they showed themselves to me, what they wanted me to understand, why they left me with this burden of knowledge that I could never adequately share with others. Sometimes I imagine they'll apologize for the trauma they caused, for the decades of frustration and isolation, for the toll their visit took on my life and relationships and peace of mind. Sometimes I imagine they'll thank me for bearing witness, for refusing to forget, for keeping the memory of their presence alive, even when everyone else told me to let it go. But more likely, death will just be death, the end of consciousness, the dissolution of the self into nothingness, and I'll never know the answers to the questions that have consumed me for 60 years. The sound will die with me. That frequency will finally fade into silence, and my testimony will join the thousands of other UFO accounts gathering dust in filing cabinets and archives and obscure corners of the internet, read by believers and dismissed by skeptics, and ultimately changing nothing about humanity's official stance on the question of whether we are alone in the universe. My story will become just another anecdote, another tall tale from another old man who claimed to see something he couldn't explain, and the truth will remain buried under layers of denial and disinformation and deliberate forgetting. But for now, while I still have breath in my lungs and thought in my brain and strength enough to write or speak these words, I will continue to testify. I will tell anyone who will listen about the sound I heard that night in Salem, about the craft that hovered over the cemetery, about the figures that moved with impossible grace, about the visions that were forced into my mind, about the mark that was left on my soul that will never fade no matter how much time passes. I will tell my story because it's the truth, and the truth deserves to be told even if nobody believes it, even if telling it makes me look foolish or crazy or desperate for attention. The sound is still with me, right now as I dictate these words into a recorder that my granddaughter gave me so I could preserve my memories. I can hear it underneath my own voice, that low frequency hum, that vibration that seems to come from inside my own skull. It's saying something, I think, trying to communicate something important. But I don't have the equipment to decode it. Don't have the understanding necessary to translate alien frequencies into human meaning. Maybe that's the real tragedy of my story. Not that I saw something impossible and nobody believed me, but that I was given a message I can never fully comprehend. That I'm carrying information I can't access. That I'm a failed bridge between two intelligences that will remain forever separate because neither speaks the other's language. If you're reading this or hearing this, or however you've encountered my testimony, I have one request. Don't dismiss it out of hand just because it challenges your understanding of reality. Don't assume I'm lying or delusional just because what I'm describing seems impossible. Keep an open mind. Stay curious. Look up at the night sky sometimes and remember that the universe is far larger and stranger than we can imagine from our tiny vantage point on this small planet. And if you ever see something you can't explain, if you ever hear a sound that resonates in your chest and makes your teeth ache, if you ever feel the weight of an alien intelligence observing you, measuring you, cataloging you, know that you're not alone, that I'm here with you across the years, and that the burden of this knowledge is easier to carry when it's shared. The sound I heard that night still haunts me, and it will haunt me until my last breath. And maybe that's exactly what they intended. Maybe I'm supposed to be haunted. Maybe the haunting is the message itself. A permanent reminder that we are not the masters of this planet, or this solar system, or this universe. That there are intelligences out there so far beyond us that we are to them as insects are to us. Observed with detached curiosity or benign indifference, or perhaps with emotions and intentions we couldn't recognize as emotions or intentions because we don't have the framework to understand them. The sound is my proof, my burden, my curse, my gift. And I carry it with me into whatever comes next, hoping against hope that someday someone will listen and understand and believe, and that my testimony will have mattered, will have made a difference, will have been worth the 60 years of doubt and isolation and remembered terror that followed one October night in Salem when the universe cracked open and showed me a glimpse of its true nature, wild and incomprehensible and utterly indifferent human understanding. There are details I haven't mentioned yet, details that seem too strange even for a story as strange as this one. But they're important if you're going to understand the full scope of what happened to me and what's been happening since. In the weeks following the encounter, I started experiencing what I can only describe as episodes. Moments when the world around me would seem to flicker like a film reel skipping frames. When colors would become more vivid or completely washed out. When sounds would echo as if I was in a cathedral, even though I was standing in my kitchen or my classroom. These episodes lasted only a few seconds at most, but they were disorienting enough that I had to grip something solid to keep my balance. And they were always accompanied by that sound, that frequency, rising up from some deep place in my consciousness, like a whale surfacing from the depths of the ocean. Margaret noticed them, of course. She would see me freeze mid-sentence, see my eyes go unfocused and my hands start to tremble, and she'd guide me to a chair and hold my hand until the episode passed. She never made me feel crazy or weak, never suggested I see a psychiatrist, though I'm sure she must have considered it. She just accepted that something had fundamentally changed in me on that October night, and that we would have to learn to live with the aftermath together. I loved her so much for that silent understanding, for not trying to fix what couldn't be fixed or normalize what could never be normal again. The episodes were worst in the first year, after the encounter, happening sometimes multiple times a day, but they gradually decreased in frequency over time until by the early 70s, they were only occurring once every few months, and by the 80s, maybe once or twice a year. But they never stopped completely, and even now, decades later, I'll occasionally find myself standing in the hallway of this facility with no memory of how I got there, my ears ringing with that impossible frequency, my vision swimming with afterimages of lights that aren't there. The staff thinks it's dementia, natural deterioration of an aging brain, and I let them think that because the alternative explanation would only get me transferred to the psychiatric ward. But the episodes aren't the strangest part. The strangest part is what I started finding in the months after the encounter, evidence that I wasn't the only person who had experienced something unusual in Salem that night. I became obsessed with checking the local newspaper every day, scanning for any mention of strange lights or unusual occurrences. And in early November of '65, I found a small article buried on page 7 about a local farmer who reported that several of his cows had been found dead in his field with no apparent cause, their bodies showing unusual markings that the veterinarian couldn't explain. The farm was located about 3 miles from the cemetery where I'd seen the craft, in the direction it had traveled when it first emerged from the woods. I drove out to the farm on a Saturday, told the farmer I was a teacher doing research on unusual animal deaths for a science class, and he showed me where he'd found the cows. The grass in that area had the same burned quality I'd seen in the cemetery, though not in as perfect a circle, more of an irregular oval maybe 20 feet across. The farmer said the strange thing was that his dogs had been going crazy that night, howling and barking from around 10:30 until well past midnight, and his chickens hadn't laid eggs for 3 days afterward. He said he'd heard a sound like nothing he'd ever heard before, felt it more than heard it really, said it made his teeth hurt and gave him the worst headache of his life. He was describing the same sound I'd heard, the same frequency, and when I looked in his eyes, I saw the same haunted expression I'd been seeing in my own mirror every morning. I asked him if he'd reported it to anyone official, and he laughed. Said he'd called the police, and they'd sent a young officer out, who took a few notes, and then suggested maybe it was lightning, even though there hadn't been any storms that week. He asked me if I knew what had really happened, and I almost told him. I was so close to sharing my own experience with someone who might actually understand, but I remembered the warning from those men in dark suits, and I kept my mouth shut. I regret that now. I should have told him, should have shared the burden of knowledge with someone else who'd been marked by that night. But I was afraid of the consequences, and I let that fear silence me when I should have spoken up. Over the next few months, I found 3 other people in the Salem area who had experienced something unusual on October 15th, 1965. There was a truck driver who'd been on Route 114 around 11 that night and had seen lights in the sky that he said looked like no aircraft he'd ever seen. And he'd driven trucks past the Air Force Base enough times to know what military planes looked like. There was a nurse at Salem Hospital who'd been working the night shift and had stepped outside for a cigarette break when she saw a glow coming from the direction of the woods, bright enough that she thought there must be a fire. But when no fire trucks went by, she figured she must have been mistaken. And there was a teenage boy who'd been sneaking home past curfew after a date and had hidden behind a tree when he saw what he described as a huge flying saucer hovering over the old cemetery. He'd watched it for several minutes before running home in terror. And when he told his parents, they punished him for lying and making up stories. I interviewed each of these people separately, carefully, never revealing my own experience, but asking detailed questions about what they'd seen and heard and felt. and the pattern was consistent. They'd all experienced something extraordinary between 10:30 and midnight on that Thursday night. They'd all described lights and craft and sounds that defied conventional explanation. And they'd all been dismissed or ignored or ridiculed when they tried to report it. We were a small community of witnesses scattered across Salem, connected by an experience we couldn't share with the wider world, bound by a secret that was eating us alive from the inside. I wanted to bring us all together, to organize some kind of support group where we could talk openly about what we'd seen without fear of judgment or mockery. But I was afraid of drawing attention from those government men who'd warned me to keep quiet, afraid of losing my job if my principal found out I was still pursuing this obsession, afraid of what it would mean to fully acknowledge that yes, this was real, this happened, we are not alone, and we have been contacted by something beyond our understanding. So I kept the names and addresses of my fellow witnesses in a locked drawer in my desk, visiting each of them once or twice over the years to check in, to make sure they were okay, to remind myself that I wasn't the only one carrying this burden. The truck driver died in a car accident in 1972, drove his rig off the road late at night for no apparent reason, and I've always wondered if he had one of those episodes while he was driving. If the sound suddenly overwhelmed him and he lost control. The nurse moved away from Salem in the mid-70s, sent me a Christmas card for a few years, with brief notes saying she was doing well, but the nightmares had never stopped. The teenage boy, who by the time I last spoke to him in the 80s, was a middle-aged man with a family of his own, told me he'd tried to forget about that night, tried to convince himself it had been a dream or a hallucination brought on by teenage hormones and fear of his parents' anger. But the memory was too vivid, too detailed, too real to dismiss. He said he appreciated that I'd believed him when everyone else thought he was crazy or lying. Said it had meant more to him than I could know. And I wished I'd been brave enough to tell him about my own experience, to let him know that he truly wasn't alone. The farmer kept in touch until he passed away in '98. He would call me every few years, always on October 15th, and we'd talk for hours about that night, speculating about what we'd witnessed and what it meant, and whether they would ever come back. He developed cancer in the mid-90s, a particularly aggressive form that the doctor said was unusual for someone with no family history of the disease and no obvious environmental risk factors. And I've wondered ever since if there was a connection to his exposure to whatever energy or radiation that Kraft was emitting. His wife called me after he died to say that his last words had been about the sound, that he'd said he could hear it calling him home, and I didn't know whether that was comforting or terrifying. In 1976, I attended a UFO conference in Boston. My first and only time engaging with the wider community of believers and researchers who had made the study of unexplained aerial phenomena their life's work. I went anonymously, didn't present my own case, just sat in the audience and listened to dozens of other witnesses describe their encounters. What struck me most was how similar many of the accounts were to my own experience. People from all over the country and even other parts of the world describing the same disc-shaped craft, the same pulsing lights, the same otherworldly sounds, the same sense of being observed by an intelligence that was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. These weren't crazy people. They were ordinary folks. Teachers and farmers and nurses and truck drivers and police officers and military pilots. People with no reason to lie and nothing to gain from sharing their stories except ridicule and disbelief. But what also struck me was the atmosphere of the conference itself, the way it attracted not just sincere researchers and witnesses, but also con artists and attention seekers, and people peddling wild theories about government conspiracies and alien invasions, and ancient astronauts building the pyramids. The signal-to-noise ratio was terrible, genuine accounts drowned out by sensationalism and speculation. And I understood why mainstream science refused to take the phenomenon seriously when it was surrounded by so much nonsense. I left the conference feeling more isolated than ever, realizing that even within the UFO community, I didn't quite fit, that my experience was mine alone and couldn't be adequately shared or understood even by people who claimed to believe. I never went to another conference, but I kept reading everything I could find on the subject. I read the scientific studies that attempted to explain UFO sightings as misidentifications or psychological phenomena or atmospheric anomalies. I read the accounts from military personnel who had tracked unknown objects on radar moving at speeds and making maneuvers that no known aircraft could achieve. I read the theories about where these craft might come from, other planets or other dimensions or other times, visitors from the past or the future or somewhere else entirely. And I read the darker theories, the accounts of abductions and medical examinations and genetic experiments, stories from people who claimed they'd been taken aboard these craft and subjected to procedures they couldn't fully remember or understand. I've never been entirely certain whether I was abducted that night or not. My memory of the encounter is continuous from the moment the lights first flickered to the moment I found myself on my classroom floor with a nosebleed. But there's a quality to those memories that's different from my other memories, dreamlike almost, as if I'm remembering a film I watched rather than something I directly experienced. And there are gaps, moments when time seems to skip or jump, when I'm looking at the craft from my window and then suddenly I'm on the floor without any clear recollection of the transition. It's possible that I'm simply not remembering everything that happened, that my mind has blocked out portions of the encounter that were too traumatic to integrate, that the visions I saw of alien worlds and impossible geometries weren't just transmitted into my mind, but were memories of places I'd actually been taken to in the missing time. The thought terrifies me even now, the possibility that I was inside that craft, that those tall, thin figures examined me or took samples from me or implanted something in me that's been broadcasting that frequency into my skull for 60 years. I've had X-rays and CT scans over the years for various medical reasons, and I've always studied the images carefully looking for any evidence of foreign objects or anomalies. But if something was implanted, it was either too small to see on standard medical imaging or made of materials that don't show up the way metal or ceramic would. Sometimes I wake up from dreams in which I'm lying on a table in a room with walls that curve in impossible directions, and there are figures standing over me with instruments I don't recognize, and they're doing something to my head, drilling or probing or installing something. And I can feel it happening, but I can't move or cry out. I'm paralyzed and helpless and utterly at their mercy. Are those dreams memories or just my imagination filling in gaps with horror movie imagery? I honestly don't know, and not knowing is its own special kind of torture. Worse in some ways than if I could remember everything clearly. At least then I'd know the full extent of what was done to me. I could process it and integrate it and move forward. But this uncertainty, this sense that there's a whole section of that night that's been redacted from my memory, keeps me trapped in a state of perpetual anxiety, always wondering what really happened during those missing minutes or hours. I've tried hypnotic regression, went to a therapist in the mid-'80s who specialized in recovered memory therapy. She put me under and tried to take me back to that night, to access the memories that my conscious mind couldn't reach, but the session ended badly. As soon as she started asking me questions about the craft and the figures, I began to convulse, my body going rigid and my hands clawing at my head as if trying to dig something out of my skull. The sound, that frequency, became so loud in my head that I was screaming, and she had to bring me out of the trance immediately. She said she'd never seen a reaction like that before, that it was as if there was a wall in my mind protecting those memories, a barrier that caused intense pain when she tried to breach it. She advised me not to try again, said that whatever I'd experienced had traumatized me so severely that my psyche had walled it off for my own protection, and trying to force my way through that wall might cause more harm than good. But I wonder sometimes if the wall isn't natural, if it wasn't put there by my own mind, but by them, whoever or whatever they are. If they have the technology to travel between stars, to manipulate gravity and inertia, to transmit visions directly into human brains, surely they have the ability to edit memories, to block access to certain experiences, to leave us with just enough recollection to know something happened, but not enough to fully understand what. Maybe that's part of their methodology, their way of studying us without contaminating the results, leaving us with fragments and impressions rather than clear memories that might change our behavior or beliefs in ways they don't want. In 2004, about a year after Margaret died, something happened that reignited my obsession with the events of that October night. I was living alone in our house on the coast, spending most of my time reading or watching television or taking walks along the beach, when I received an unexpected package in the mail. There was no return address, just my name and address written in neat block letters, and inside was a folder containing photocopies of what appeared to be official government documents. They were heavily redacted, whole paragraphs blacked out with marker, but what remained was readable enough to make my blood run cold. The documents were from something called Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official UFO investigation program that I'd read about years before. They contained reports of multiple UFO sightings in the Salem, Massachusetts area on the night of October 15th, 1965, including a detailed account from a high school teacher who had observed an unidentified craft hovering over a cemetery. That was me, my report, the one I'd made to the police that had supposedly gone nowhere. But apparently it had been forwarded to Project Blue Book, and some investigator had written up a summary along with interviews from other witnesses. The truck driver and the nurse and the teenage boy and the farmer. All the people I'd thought had been ignored and dismissed. The conclusion section of the report was particularly interesting. The investigator had noted the consistency of the accounts, the physical evidence in the form of the burned grass and dead cattle, the electromagnetic effects reported by multiple witnesses. He had classified the incident as unexplained, recommending further investigation and suggesting that the craft might represent advanced technology of unknown origin. But someone higher up in the chain of command had overruled him, written in the margins that the case was to be closed and classified as insufficient data, and that no further investigation was warranted. The final page of the report had a note stamped in red ink that said witness has been interviewed and advised to maintain discretion. And I remembered those two men in dark suits and their friendly warning. Who had sent me these documents? And why now, almost 40 years after the incident? There was no note, no explanation, just the photocopied pages that someone had clearly taken considerable risk to obtain and mail to me. I looked through them again and again, trying to find some clue to the sender's identity, but there was nothing. The postmark was from Boston, but that didn't tell me much. All I knew was that someone out there knew about my experience, had access to classified files, and wanted me to know that my encounter had been documented and investigated, and then deliberately buried. The documents changed something in me, reawakened a sense of purpose I'd lost after Margaret's death. If the government had investigated and then covered up what happened in Salem, how many other incidents had been treated the same way? How much evidence was sitting in classified files somewhere, proof of extraterrestrial visitation that the public would never be allowed to see? I started writing letters to my congressional representatives, to the Air Force, to anyone I thought might have the authority to declassify these files, demanding transparency and accountability. Most of my letters went unanswered, and the few responses I received were form letters thanking me for my interest and assuring me that national security matters were being handled appropriately by the relevant authorities. But I kept writing, kept pushing, kept demanding answers. And slowly I began to connect with other people who were doing the same thing. Researchers and activists and former military personnel who believed the government was hiding the truth about UFOs. We formed a loose network, sharing information and strategies, filing Freedom of Information Act requests, and pressuring politicians to take the issue seriously. It was frustrating, exhausting work that rarely produced tangible results, but it gave me something to focus on, a way to channel the anger and confusion and fear that had been building inside me for decades. Then in 2017, something remarkable happened. The New York Times published an article revealing the existence of a secret Pentagon program that had been investigating UFO reports from military personnel, along with video footage from Navy pilots showing objects moving in ways that defied the laws of physics as we understand them. The article was a bombshell, the first time a mainstream media outlet had treated the subject seriously in decades. And suddenly UFOs were being discussed on cable news and in the halls of Congress without the usual smirking dismissiveness. The government was admitting, finally, that there were objects in our skies that we couldn't identify and didn't understand, that pilots were encountering these things regularly, and that maybe, just maybe, we should be paying attention. I watched the coverage with tears streaming down my face, vindicated after more than 50 years of being told I was crazy or mistaken or lying. Here was proof, official military footage and testimony from credible witnesses, and the conversation was shifting from whether UFOs exist to what they are, and where they come from, and what we should do about them. It was too late for me to feel any real satisfaction. Too late for Margaret, who never lived to see this moment of validation. Too late for the truck driver and the farmer and all the other witnesses who had died still carrying the burden of their unbelieved experiences. But it was something, a crack in the wall of official denial, a sign that maybe the truth would eventually emerge, even if it took another 50 years. The sound in my head grew louder during those weeks when UFOs were in the news. Not painfully loud, but present, insistent, as if whatever had implanted that frequency in my skull 60 years ago was responding to the increased attention, reminding me that I was still marked, still connected to something beyond human understanding. I started having the episodes again more frequently, moments when reality would flicker and shift, when I would catch glimpses of something just at the edge of my perception. Shadows moving in ways shadows shouldn't move. Lights appearing in my peripheral vision that vanished when I tried to look directly at them. My doctor, concerned about these symptoms, ordered a full neurological workup, MRI and EEG, and cognitive tests. The results showed some age-related deterioration. Nothing unusual for a man in his 80s, but nothing that would explain the specific nature of my experiences. The neurologist asked me if I'd been under unusual stress lately, if anything had happened to trigger these episodes, and I almost told him about Salem, about the craft and the sound and the 60 years of haunting. But I looked at his young face, his expensive watch, and his confident manner, and I knew he wouldn't understand, wouldn't believe, would just add a note to my file about possible schizophrenia or dementia and increase my medications. So I lied, said I'd been watching too much television news and it was making me anxious, said I'd cut back and try to relax more. He seemed satisfied with that explanation, prescribed some anti-anxiety medication I never filled, and sent me on my way with instructions to follow up in 6 months. I left his office feeling more alone than ever, realizing that even in this new era of openness about UFOs, there was still a vast gulf between military footage of distant objects and the intimate, terrifying experience of being in the presence of something utterly alien, of being changed by that presence in ways that couldn't be measured or quantified or treated with medication. I'm running out of time now. I can feel it in my bones, in the way my heart sometimes skips beats, in the increasing frequency of the episodes, in the way the sound is getting louder and more insistent. Something is building toward a conclusion. I don't know what. Maybe just my death, maybe something more. Sometimes I think they're calling me home, that the frequency has always been a kind of homing beacon, that when I die my consciousness will be pulled back to wherever they came from, absorbed into their collective intelligence, or downloaded into their databases, or recycled into some new form of existence. It's a strange comfort, the idea that death might not be the end, but just another transition, another phase in a journey that began on that October night in 1965. Or maybe I'm just an old man clinging to delusions, trying to make meaning out of an experience that was nothing more than a hallucination or a neurological event or a waking dream. Maybe there was no craft, no figures, no sound except the one generated by my own brain misfiring in some spectacular fashion. Maybe I've wasted the last 60 years of my life chasing shadows and ignoring the real world in favor of a fantasy that makes me feel special, chosen, important in some cosmic drama. I consider these possibilities in my darkest moments, turning them over in my mind like stones, testing their weight against my memories. But then I remember the burned grass that took years to grow back, the consistency of the other witnesses' accounts, the official documents that someone risked their career to send me, the Navy footage that matches what I saw 50 years earlier. I remember the look in that farmer's eyes when he described the sound, the same haunted expression I see in my own reflection, and I know it was real. I know it happened. I know that whatever I experienced that night was not a product of my imagination, but a genuine encounter with intelligence from somewhere else. The sound is real. The mark it left on me is real. And the truth of what happened in Salem in 1965 is real whether anyone believes it or not. I hope that when I'm gone, someone will find these recordings, this testimony, and add it to the growing body of evidence that we are not alone in the universe, that we have been visited by beings whose technology and motives we can barely begin to understand, and that the witnesses who have tried to tell their stories deserve to be heard and believed rather than dismissed and ridiculed. I hope that future generations will look back on this era of denial and cover-up with the same bewilderment we feel when we consider how long it took humanity to accept other obvious truths, how long we insisted the Earth was flat, or the center of the universe, or that powered flight was impossible. The sound I heard that night in Salem still haunts me. It will haunt me tomorrow, and the next day, and however many days I have left before my heart finally gives out, and my brain shuts down, and this long, strange journey comes to its end. But I'm not afraid anymore, not of death, not of judgment, not of being remembered as a crazy old man who claimed to see flying saucers. I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know what was done to me and what I became because of it. And that knowledge is enough. The truth doesn't need my fear or my defense. It simply is patient and eternal, waiting for the day when humanity is finally ready to accept it without flinching, without denying, without hiding behind comfortable lies and official explanations that explain nothing.